Rakkaat Kallion kirkon vieraat, mun nimi on Anna Tervahartjala ja mulla on ilo toivottaa teidät tervetulleeksi tänne tänään. Mä itse edustan Kirkon ulkomaanapua ja ulkomaanavun rauhanverkostoa. Saadaanko me ilmeisesti toimiko mikki? Okei, no niin, nyt kuuluu ja kaikuu. Eli rakkaat Kallion kirkon vieraat, mun nimi on Anna Tervahartjala ja mä edustan täällä Kirkon ulkomaanapua ja ulkomaanavun rauhanverkostoa. Mulla on ilo esitellä meidän seuraava vieras, mutta mä vaihan seuraavaksi englanniksi, jotta myös hän tietää, mistä on kyse ja hän pysyy kartalla ja osaa aloittaa ajallaan. So dear guests, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the Church of Kallio. I personally sit here to represent Finchurch Aid and the Peacemakers Network. So I represent an organization dedicated to support peace in some of the most complex conflicts in the world. And today, it's my pleasure to welcome, it's quite odd that I say this, but it is my pleasure to welcome one of the founders of a racist supremacist organization that in the end developed to be one of the biggest of the world. Well, it's my pleasure to welcome Arno Michelis, who today, just as he before was one of the co-founders of a racist movement, leads a peace-building organization dedicated to peace, reconciliation, and dialogue. So Arno, I will leave the stage for yourself, and you will lead us through your session.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anna.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone who came out today, everyone at the church and the Peace Builders Network. It's a great honor, and it's a treat for me to visit Helsinki. This is my first trip to Finland, and I've been here about 24 hours, and I'm already loving it. So I look forward to exploring the city and the country in the course of my visit. I'm going to begin today by introducing you to who I was 20 years ago.
We must secure the existence of our race and the future of our white children. This one's called
I'm actually very ashamed to share that video with you. I'm ashamed of who I was, of the way I acted. I'm ashamed at the acts of violence that I committed against innocent people for no other reason than the color of their skin, because I thought they were gay, because I was drunk and they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. I am ashamed that my band and I made music designed to make people hurt each other because of the color of their skin. As ashamed as I am of who I was and ashamed of that music, I do play that video before many of my talks. And I think it's important that I do that because I need to be accountable for my mistakes. I need to be accountable for the harm that I've done to innocent people, the harm I've done to society, the harm that I've done to my family, and the harm that I've done to myself. In order to begin a healing process, we have to look at the past with openness and with honesty. And we need to look at it through a lens of compassion. Compassion is what brought me to a point where I was ultimately looking for an excuse to not be that person anymore. Forgiveness and kindness are the graces of our human experience that led me from white power hate groups in 1994, after being involved since 1987. Believe it or not, the evening that video was taken was the evening that I found the excuse I was looking for to leave white supremacist hate groups. Now, at first glance, I wouldn't have seemed like the kind of kid that would get involved in violent extremism. I grew up in a suburb of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is a city in the Midwest of the United States. For those of you not familiar with Milwaukee, it's about 90 miles north of Chicago, about an hour and a half drive on a good day. It's on the shores of Lake Michigan, a beautiful inland lake. And the suburb where I grew up was very well-to-do. Most people in my suburb were very wealthy. My family, compared to most people in our suburb, did not have the kind of money that many of my neighbors did and many of my peers had. But by world standards, we were incredibly wealthy. Now that I've grown and I've had the very good fortune to travel the world fairly extensively, I understand that there are literally billions of children on the face of this earth who would have happily traded childhoods with me. My childhood was really pretty idyllic. I grew up in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. I never went hungry. I always had clothes to wear. I always had a roof over my head. I never was beaten. My parents were together. They both loved me very much. They let me know that all the time. They let me know how smart I was and how wonderful I was and how I could accomplish anything that I wanted to accomplish. I had a lot of positive reinforcement as a child. But I grew up in an alcoholic household, and my parents fought a lot, and my mom was always stressed out. She was miserable. Many times she had to work 2 jobs to help keep the bills paid in our house. And as a child, I could tell my mom was suffering, and that made me suffer. Fortunately, most human beings who suffer, and I think all of us suffer in one way or another, most human beings find a healthy way to process that suffering, to stop it from being transferred to someone else. I did not as a child, even though many healthy ways were offered to me. Instead, I became a bully at school. I started hurting other kids because I was suffering. Hurt people hurt people. Again, fortunately, not all hurt people, but I genuinely believe that all violence in the world, all violence throughout human history, comes from suffering. I believe that a human being who is happy and healthy and well-adjusted has no motivation to commit violence against other human beings. But as I went through suffering during my childhood, I started to hurt other kids. And I started to get a kick out of that. I got a thrill from that. It was a rush. I was what you would call an adrenaline junkie. That feeling you get when something exciting happens, that was my addiction. And I created excitement by creating problems at school. by pushing other kids around, by making teachers angry. And like any other form of addiction, what was a thrill the first time, 10 times later, is no longer a thrill. You have to keep escalating the antisocial behavior in order to get the same kind of thrill. So as I grew older, I went from being a bully on the school bus to breaking and entering into places, stealing things, to committing vandalism, to getting in fights in the street. As a teenager, I started drinking myself. Alcoholism is very much an environmental disease as well as a genetic one. The first time I drank, I was 14 years old. I drank until I passed out. And I drank like that for another 20 years. By the time I was 16 years old, I was drinking heavily, very regularly. And I want to make a point to say that that's by no means an excuse for what I've done. I never want to make it sound like it wasn't my fault because of alcohol. But alcohol was certainly a factor. The alcohol made it easier for me to disconnect myself from the humanity of others. It made it easier for me to commit violence. But I made the choice to drink that alcohol. No one forced that upon me. I need to take responsibility for that. By the time I was 16, I was very violent. I had been violent since I was a little kid. I was familiar with violence. I had convinced myself that I enjoyed violence. I convinced myself that I enjoyed getting hit. I got in a lot of fights. I wasn't a particularly talented fighter, so I got hit quite a bit. And I had myself believing that getting hit was fun. As a teenager, I think all human beings who were ever a teenager in their life had at least one moment when a parent or a teacher stopped them from doing something they wanted to do, and their hormones are raging, and they go, "Oh, I hate you." I think every one of us has been through that for at least a moment. For me, that was just part of the rush. So I didn't stop there. I was like, "Oh, I hate you, and I hate this school, and I hate cops, and I hate government, and I hate society. I hate it all." And that rush of hatred became part of my addiction. It was then that I heard white power skinhead music. Now, I was already into punk music, which I still love. I never want to make it sound like punk rock is some kind of gateway drug to becoming a white power skinhead. But I loved punk because it was fast, and I felt it was violent, and I loved the aggression that came through the music. White power skinhead music had that same aggression, but the lyrics carried the themes that Adolf Hitler used to inspire people to murder back in 1930s Germany in World War II. The music I was listening to was fast and aggressive, and it talked about blood and honor and race and nation. And it told me how I was a warrior fighting for my people against these evil hordes that were coming to wipe my race off the face of the earth. Now that sounds ridiculous as I say it now. I trust it sounds ridiculous to all of you. But to a 16-year-old angry, drunken kid, it was literally music to my ears. It took all of the hate and violence that I was already familiar with, and it validated it. It gave it a context. It gave me a reason to not only continue hate and violence, but to amplify it and to justify it. And it really made people angry. Remember, my habit was making people angry. That was my addiction. I wanted to make people as angry as I could. And few things make people angry like a swastika does. Now, I wasn't ignorant as to why people were angry when they saw a swastika. I knew about the Holocaust. I knew about World War II and what the Germans did. But I didn't care. All I cared about was that it made people mad. And that's what brought me into the white power skinhead counterculture in 1987, was the music. Along with a couple friends, I started a white power skinhead gang in Milwaukee. We started our own white power skinhead band. I had been in punk bands for a couple years before that. I still don't have a lick of musical talent, but I could scream really loud. And I could get people crazy. And I like being on stage. I love feeling the music. So our band was pretty successful. My friend who played guitar had a lot of charisma. People liked to see him on stage. And we started to gather other angry white kids around us. And now we were the ones transferring that message to them through our music, that they were warriors fighting for the white race against this horrible plot to kill us all. And kids who were having trouble in their lives were very happy to hear that. They were happy to hear that the trouble they were having wasn't their fault, it was Jewish people's fault. It was black people's fault. It was gay people's fault. It was everyone's fault but theirs. And rather than do the work, the difficult work it takes to improve your own life and to change your own bad habits, it's much easier to blame that on other people. And as my friends and I radiated hostility into the world reflected that hostility back at us, oftentimes in multiples. So that within 6 months of starting this gang, my best friend went to prison for shooting a kid who came to do a drive-by shooting on our house. Within 2 years, another best friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight. He was a white kid who went to a school that was predominantly black. And he got beat up all the time because he was white. He came to us looking for power, looking for answers, looking for hate and violence. He was out practicing hate and violence as I had taught him to do when he was shot and killed. That happened in 1990, and that murder drove me further into the hate movement. My friends and I went on a rampage through the city of Milwaukee, attacking people at random that lasted for months, transferring our suffering at our friend's murder onto everyone else. And all along, not stopping to think that maybe it was our fault for initiating this hostility that brought that murder to happen. Instead, we kept blaming everyone else. In 1992, I became a parent. I had a skinhead girlfriend, and we felt it was our duty as white people to have white children. And so my daughter was willfully conceived and born in November of 1992. I would love to tell you that fatherhood changed me, made me realize how wrong my course was. Unfortunately, it didn't. And actually, a week after my daughter was born, I went out with my younger brother. We went to a bar. We got in a huge fight, fought everybody at the bar. And I came home at 2 a.m, stinking drunk, covered with other people's blood. And my girlfriend, who was nursing our infant daughter, started tearing into me, telling me what a horrible father I was, what a horrible person I was. And I had no answer for her other than to grab an EK combat dagger I had stashed next to my bed, which is a knife about this long, the blade's about like that. It's sharp enough to shave with. And I just looked at her and I said, "Is this what you want?" Boom! And I just about took my left hand off with it. Fortunately, my skinhead girlfriend was not squeamish at the sight of blood. And fortunately, she was fairly well versed in first aid. I wouldn't be here telling you this story otherwise. She was able to wrap my wrist in a bed sheet and kneel on it to keep me from bleeding to death as she called emergency services, who came and saved my life. And that happened a week after my daughter was born. Looking back, I understand that there was a lot more to that suicide attempt than just getting yelled at by my girlfriend. Looking back, I understand that the reason why I hated other people was because I really hated myself. And I hated living. I hated life. And it was very easy for me to take that knife and try to end my life with it. It could definitely be argued that that entire period of my life, where I was constantly blacked out drunk, constantly getting in fights, constantly exposing myself to danger that could have killed me, it could be argued that that was an ongoing suicide attempt. That's how miserable I was during that 7-year period that I was involved in hate groups. Now, I'm very fortunate to be able to do talks like this all over the world to all kinds of audiences, and I love interacting with the audience. So I hope all of you, as you're listening, if questions come to mind, know that we're going to dedicate some time today to answer your questions. If a question comes to mind and you're thinking, I don't know if I should ask him that, that's the question I want to get. Give me the hardest questions. A question I get quite often, probably the most asked question, is what made you change? And the answer is exhaustion. It was exhausting to live that way. It was exhausting because I knew what I was doing was wrong. There were times, even as I was hitting someone, that there was a voice in my head and in my heart that said, "What are you doing? This is wrong. Why are you doing this?" And I didn't have the courage to answer that voice. So rather than face the tough questions in my heart, I tried to suppress that knowledge with alcohol, with white power music, surrounding myself by other mad white kids. I was constantly expending energy to suppress the knowledge that what I was doing was wrong. That was exhausting. It was exhausting to cut myself off from the rest of society, including aspects of media and culture that I had once taken for granted. Now, being from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, in the States, we have our own version of football there. It's different than what you guys call football here. I have to admit that the European, really the world definition of football is much more appropriate. Because in American football, the foot rarely touches the ball, actually. But be that as it may, our football team in Wisconsin was called the Green Bay Packers. And I love the Packers, like everybody in Wisconsin. But when I was a white power skinhead, I couldn't very well enjoy a Packer game. Because half the guys on the team, if not more, were black guys. The other guys were white guys. And they not only had to get along, they had to function as a unit if they wanted to win a football game. So on Sundays, when American football is typically played, rather than enjoy the football game with my skinhead buddies, I would lock myself in this dingy efficiency apartment I had, and I'd turn the TV on really low, and I'd be like, "Woo, touchdown." And it was ridiculous. It wasn't lost on me how ridiculous it was to think that way and act that way. But I could not enjoy a simple thing like a football game because of this ideology that I had burdened myself with. That was exhausting. What was most exhausting, though, was when people who I claimed to hate treated me with kindness. When I experienced kindness from people who I perceived as enemies, it destroyed everything that I was trying to think and believe. I was very fortunate that during the 7-year involvement in hate groups, there were times when a Jewish boss, a lesbian supervisor, black and Latino coworkers treated me with kindness when I least deserved it, but when I needed it most. And every time one of those acts of kindness happened, it made my skin crawl because I was so unfamiliar with kindness It was an uncomfortable experience to me to just experience it. But as far as my mind went, I knew it made me a hypocrite, because here I am saying that Jewish people are evil. Jewish people are trying to kill all the white people on earth. Black people are savage. They're trying to kill all the white people on earth. But my life and the experience I went through didn't support that. I dropped out of high school, what a lot of people call gymnasium in Scandinavia, when I was 16 years old after my second year of high school. And I did that because I'm a gifted genius. I don't know if I mentioned that, but I am a gifted genius. My mom says all the time. I've been told this since a very young age. And as a gifted genius, like, why do I need to go to school? So I quit going to school. And my mother, being a very practical person, said, if you're not going to go to school, you need to get a job. And fortunately, she had a friend of hers from when she went to high school named Jack Cooper. And Jack had a business printing T-shirts. So she asked Jack if he would give me a job. Jack said, sure. And so there I was, 16 years old, working 40 hours a week, printing T-shirts, third shift from about 11 p.m. till 7 a.m. And I thought I was quite clever. I thought I had it made. I had my own little paycheck. I went home, I got drunk, I hung out with my skinhead buddies. All I had to do was show up to work on time and print T-shirts. Now, when I was at work, I was very outspoken about my racist beliefs. Everybody I worked with knew that I was a racist because I told them all the time. All the white guys I worked with, I tried to recruit into my gang. All the black and Latino guys I worked with, I would talk to them, but I would try to get them to agree with me about racial separation. One of the tactics I would use if I worked with a black guy, I'd say, how do you like it when you see a black girl with a white man? And half these guys would be like, yeah, I don't really like that at all. And I'm like, see, we're better off if we're separate. Everybody's better off. So everybody knew about my thoughts. They knew about my racist beliefs. Not only did I espouse my racist beliefs at work, but I wore a jacket with a swastika on it to work, hanging it on the hook in the break room. Jack, my mom's friend, happened to be Jewish. And my mom, who did pre-press artwork for the T-shirts from home and kind of worked there with me, heard that I was wearing this jacket with a swastika into Jack's factory. She called up Jack in tears, basically to say that she understands if he fires me. She called him up to say, Jack, I don't know where I went wrong. I don't know what to do. I don't know what I can do about it. And I don't blame you if you fire my son. In fact, I would fire him if I was you. Rather than fire me, Jack said, he's a good kid. He's just going through a phase. And not only did he not fire me, he hired my skinhead buddies. He gave my buddy Pat, who played guitar in my band, a job selling the T-shirts on the phone. Now, Pat's voice today, as then, made my voice sound like a prepubescent Swedish boy. So Pat was on the phone calling up T-shirt shops in the mall going, hey, do you want to buy some Metallica T-shirts? And he actually sold a lot of T-shirts. Also, while I was working there, I was good at getting there on time, and I was very good at printing T-shirts, which probably both worked in my favor to help keep my job. But I wasn't good at packing myself a lunch because I was always drinking. So one day at lunch in the break room, I'm collapsed in the corner in this miserable heap, and I'm all hungover, and I'm just like radiating suffering. So I'm in such bad shape, and I got nothing to eat. And a black guy that I work with is sitting down with his lunch, and he opens it up. He's got a sandwich that's cut in half, and he sees me there in the corner, and he goes, hey, skinhead, you want to have this sandwich? Now, me being the superior white man, the last thing I wanted to do was go and accept the sandwich from my black coworker. But hunger is a powerful motivator. So I get up, I snatch the sandwich out of his hand, I don't even say thank you. I go back in the corner. I wolf it down. My coworker who shared a sandwich with me doesn't bat an eye. He just eats the rest of his lunch, and he's talking about the Packer game with my coworkers. And I kind of want to be like, oh yeah, wasn't that awesome when the touchdown happened? Oh, I can't. I hate black people. I hate Latino people. So here I am in the corner feeling like an idiot, but again, not having the courage to call myself out. Say, why don't you change? Why don't you give this up? Instead, I would go home, I'd get as drunk as I could, and I'd get other angry white kids around me, and I would tell them how the Jews are taking our money to give the lazy black people who don't want to work. When in reality, I have a means of supporting myself, as does my best friend, because of the good graces of a Jewish man, and my black coworkers actually feed me. Kindness is what drove home the hypocrisy that I was engaging in. And it built and built in exhaustion until by 1994, the night that video was taken, I was looking for an excuse to leave. Now that excuse came in a two-stage process. Earlier that year, my skinhead girlfriend and I had broke up. Go figure, but hate and violence and alcohol is not a recipe for a healthy relationship between a man and a woman. So when my daughter was 18 months old, I found myself a single parent. And a few months after that, the night of that concert, a second friend of mine was shot and killed in a street fight. Do you want to roll the rest from here? By that time, I had lost count of how many of my friends had been incarcerated, and it finally hit me, if I didn't change my ways, death or prison was going to take me from my daughter. That was the day I left the white power skinhead movement. My daughter ultimately did help to change the course of my life, along with these acts of kindness by my brave boss and coworker who refused to be subject to my hostility, and along with the dedication of my parents who always refused to give up on me. For all of their struggles and all the difficulty of my childhood, my parents always let me know they loved me and they would never give up. Those things helped to lead me from the white power movement, lead me to the life I live today. The pictures you see now are a glimpse of that life. I travel all over the place. I meet amazing people. And I'm so happy to say that all of the people I claim to hate are now people who I love dearly, who make my life a richer, more rewarding process than it could have been otherwise. Now, as you see these pictures, you'll notice a big difference between the Arno here and the Arno at the beginning. Does anyone want to say what the first thing they notice different is? The smile? Smile is the answer we're looking for. I did this talk in Abu Dhabi at a CVE conference, and somebody said, your body. And I'm like, oh, thanks. They're like, no, your body language. And I'm like, oh, okay, sure. Now, wait, my body may have changed a bit since I was 23 years old. That's okay, though, because my heart is what is important. My heart has gone through a process of learning and growth that would not have happened if it wasn't for amazing people that I used to say were a problem came and ultimately saved my life. I really believe that had I not walked away in 1994, that death or prison would have not only taken me from my daughter, but taken me from this world. So in this picture, you see my brother and I. We had just gotten a tattoo on our hands. Do you see the family resemblance? This is my brother, Pardeep Kalika. Him and I became brothers on August 5th of 2012. That's the North American date format there. We got that tattoo on our hands together because on that day, Pardeep's father, Satwant Singh Kalika, along with 5 other people, were killed by a white power skinhead who was part of the gang that I had helped to start. A little bit of tattoo trivia. Tattoos on your palm comes off in about a month or so. We knew that getting the tattoo, but we got it there anyway because that's the logo of the organization that Pardeep and his brother helped to found, called Serve to Unite. Within days of the shooting that happened on August 5th, 2012, Pardeep, his brother Amardeep, and other survivors who had lost their father, young men who had lost their mother, people whose grandfather was murdered, decided that they were not going to let this hate crime atrocity stand as it was, and instead, inspired by the civil rights movement of the United States, which really kicked into high gear when the Ku Klux Klan set a bomb for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, that failed at killing MLK, but did kill 4 little girls. That suffering galvanized the people who drove the civil rights movement, and that civil rights movement changed the course of American history. We fully intend for the course of human history to be changed likewise because of the Sikh temple shooting. What Serve to Unite does is we bring young people together from all backgrounds, from all ethnicities, to serve each other and serve the community, to solve problems that we have in our society, and to do so in a way that's driven through the arts, through visual art, through film, music, photography. They engage in creative, arts-driven service learning, and they do this with the direction of an amazing group of people that we call global mentors. People from all over the world, some of whom are former violent extremists like myself, others maybe survivors of violent extremism like Pardeep. And these people come into our classrooms via Skype, and they inspire our students to become heroes themselves and to see each other as human beings first and foremost, before we see each other by skin color or nationality or religion or ethnicity. Since we started the Serve to Unite school program in April of 2013, our students have addressed issues like homelessness, veterans issues, human trafficking, racism, homophobia, environmental issues, gun violence, community and police relations. To give you an idea of what Serve to Unite is about, I'll tell you briefly about our flagship project last year, in which we had a Serve to Unite group of high school students from a Catholic high school who did outreach to the Muslim community in Milwaukee to organize food and clothing drives for homeless veterans of the United States military that culminated in a mural creation that now hangs in the community room at Veterans Outreach in Wisconsin. Our Catholic high school students weren't quite sure how to go about connecting with the Muslim community, so we had one of our global mentors, a brilliant woman named Yasmin Molbakis, who lives in London, UK. Yasmin used to be a recruiter for Al Mujahideen, an Islamist organization. Today, she works to help to stop young people from joining those kinds of organizations. She came into the classroom via Skype. She advised our students on how to contact and work with the local mosques. Our students followed her advice. The mosques were super into this idea. Over a period of 2 months, Milwaukee mosques gathered so much food and clothing and sanitary items for homeless veterans that it took myself and Pardeep and 6 students, 2 parents, 4 people from the mosque, and 1 person from Veterans Outreach in Wisconsin. It took us all about 15 minutes to load it all onto a truck. There was well over 2 tons of material gathered by Milwaukee's Muslim community, destroying the myth that Muslim people don't care about the United States of America and that they don't care about our military. and demonstrating that one of the pillars of Islam is service. Service to bring people together, and to all people, not just Muslim people. That's one example of many programs that our students have conceived and carried out since April of 2013. I'd like to close with our Serve to Unite anthem. This is a video that was created as the music and performed and the photography by a young man named Gene Tate, who was one of our first Serve to Unite students. He was moved to write and perform this song by the work that he did in our Serve to Unite organization. And I think it's a great way to show the power that music has to heal and to bring people together, all the more so and more powerful than the power I used to use music for to hate people.
Violence flow, but my punchlines vary. Rappers leave me less convinced than the blind, saying Bloody Mary with the lights off 3 times in the mirror. Wipe it down with Windex. The message couldn't be any clearer now. With my index and the finger right near it, there's this thing called peace, and a lot of people fear it like that thing called beef that ain't allowed to come near it. If it does, I guarantee that we can serve to unite. It's a love, love life. Word from the wise, don't fight, take flight like birds in the sky. I take a lot of risks because it doesn't hurt to try. Obviously I'm focused, using both eyes, vision 20/20/20, cause the third is disguise. Call me Mr. Gina, if you ain't heard, I'm the guy. All jokes aside, we in the same struggle, trapped in the same bubble, but still causing trouble. An eye for an eye, and nobody recovers unless you switch sides, and everybody's your brother from another mother, but the father is time. Your sisters and your brothers are your partners in crime. We all sisters and brothers, if you think it systematically, we all raising each other in one way or another. Be smooth, slowly moving on our visions. We never take a day off, we about our business. We trying to make this a better place for kids to live in. We making music that's not abusing. Whoever's listening gotta be smooth, slowly moving on our visions. We never take a day off, we about our business. We trying to make this a better place for kids to live in. We making music that's not abusing. Whoever's listening gotta be smooth. The youth are the root of our solution. Praise them, raise them, amazing. Product of environment, I am the result of a generation drift off. Is it my fault? I ain't getting pissed off. I ain't have a choice as a child, but now I have the voice to empower. The future's in our hands, the sand in the hourglass passes. Used to skip class, now I'm teaching to the masses. Peeking through your glasses, I see where you're coming from. You're either riding on a bus or getting thrown under one. As quick as lightning, but wait until the thunder comes. Cold-hearted souls, so imagine when the summer sun beams through the clouds and hits them in their chest. They notice how every move they make has an effect. We care about your past, but more about what's next. You can be a global mentor for kids in Quebec, or meet a global mentor that lives in Quebec. Give your respect for his intellect. If you practicing hate, well now's the time to stop it. Knowledge is the power, so acknowledge I'm the prophet. We all can learn a little if we take the time to listen. Serve to unite on a worldwide mission. Slowly moving on our visions. We never take a day off, we about our business. We trying to make this a better place for kids to live in. We making music that's not abusing. Whoever's listening gotta be smooth, slowly moving on our visions. We never take a day off, we about our business. We trying to make this a better place for kids to live in. We making music that's not abusing. Whoever's listening gotta be smooth. The only thing that's missing is faith and dedication. The absence of those got the whole world waiting. The only thing I ask is for y'all to be patient. Trust me, I'm a doctor that always tends to his patients. They got you brainwashed, the radio's the problem. It got you thinking that sex and drugs is the only answer. My kind of argument is action for distractions. I'ma empower the people with my activism, rapping. Be smooth, show and prove, put your city on the map. They'll try to break you down, but don't fall into the trap. Serve to unite, 3 words that might change the world overnight. Yeah, we gotta make it right. Be smooth, slowly moving on our visions. We never take a day off, we about our business. We trying to make this a better place for kids to live in. We making music that's not abusing. whoever's listening gotta be smooth. Slowly moving on our visions. We never take a day off. We about our business. We trying to make this a better place for kids to live in. We making music that's not abusing. Whoever's listening gotta be smooth.
For listening to me today, everyone. I'm very grateful, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Shall we give a hand at first? Please. There was a question just on the right. We can.
Have you done any cover-ups? Since you're yeah, I'm a friend of tattoos myself, and I was wondering if you have done any cover-up pictures after the skinhead phase. And then, secondly, do you have any contact with the former gang members? Do you know how their life is now, or did anyone else leave the gang or your crew, and or is it better just to cut every tie to the whole thing?
Awesome, great questions. A lot of my tattoos are cover-ups. This whole forearm used to be a pile of skulls and swastikas. It said white power here, and I had a bust of an SS soldier here. It was actually covered up by a very dear friend of mine who's now a very successful tattoo artist, who also used to be from my old gang. He got out a few years before I did. He's much smarter than me. And he gave me the cover-up as a gift. And we probably spent about 16 hours on it in multiple sessions because it's very difficult to cover a tattoo with color. You have to keep like going over and over and over it. I have other white power tattoos that are covered up in this sleeve by the same guy. And then on my leg here, I used to have a swastika under all of this that I did. And the same artist covered that up there. So right now I have all of my old tattoos covered up. The one racist tattoo I have remaining is this little tiny bit here. In Norse runes it says Rahoa, which means racial holy war. And if I didn't explain that to you and you weren't like studying the movement, you probably wouldn't know that. But I do plan to have that covered up as well. I'm still getting a ton of tattoos. The last tattoo I got was in Denmark. It was Hyggelig. I'm a big fan of Hygge, and that fit nicely on my 8 fingers there. It reminds me of Denmark, which is a very dear place to be. I've been there 12 times since 2014, working in counterviolent extremism. So yeah, I still love tattoos. As far as guys in my old gang go, many of them, including my buddy Pat, have also turned their life around. Pat got out of prison, and him and his wife Jane have 2 amazing sons who are like the sweetest, most gentle kids you'd ever imagine. I'm always really in awe of Pat for being such a great father when he didn't have a father really. And breaking that cycle of violence that too often goes from generation to generation. I know a lot of other people from back then. Pretty much all the guys in my band have went on with their lives. Some of them have made more drastic changes than others. There's some of them who are very progressive nowadays and very much opposed to racism. There's some who are still very conservative, but by no means anywhere like openly racist or a part of racist organizations like they used to be. There are a few guys from back then who I know are still kind of in it, and I always make outreach to them and just let them know that first of all, I'm glad they're still alive, and that I'm happy to talk with them and listen to them if they'd like to reconnect. And I haven't heard back from any of those guys. But if I were to, I'd love to talk to them and hopefully help them move in a better direction also. Yes,
Please.
ma'am.
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask about inclusion and exclusion. Mm-hmm. You talked about your workplace experience and how basically the kindness and compassion of your coworkers was what created this cognitive dissonance ultimately, where you were able to let go of the hate. But I wonder what you think about, if you'd have some advice. I think a lot of people are struggling with extremist views and racism in the workplace, and it's also important to have a kind of zero tolerance line. What do you think would be the right way to go about that kind of use in the workplace?
That's an excellent question, and it's certainly very timely. I don't think zero tolerance is ever a good policy because, as you mentioned, exclusion and exclusion, if we think about why people get involved in violent extremism of any sort, and for the past 8 years, I've worked as a counter-violent extremism consultant in many parts of the world, and I've worked with former Islamists, former right-wing, former left-wing, former street gang, former white supremacists, and there's common threads behind all of that violent extremist narrative and all the risk factors. And the most common thread, the most poignant thread, I think, is suffering. People get involved in these mindsets because they're suffering, and when we suffer, we tend to isolate ourselves, like the way a wounded animal will crawl off into a corner and just sit there. Human beings do that sometimes physically, but more often they do it emotionally and intellectually. And so the guy at work might be that, the one weird white guy who never talks to anybody. And if the first time he does talk to someone, he says some racist nonsense that's very offensive, I think the worst thing we can do is to turn our back on him and shut him off more, because the more he's isolated, the more he's going to suffer. If we look at Wade Page, the shooter who killed Pardeep's father and 5 other people, this guy was in his early 40s. He had no career. He worked a menial minimum wage factory job. He had just proposed to a girlfriend after a month or so rocky relationship. She turned him down and dumped him. His family had disowned him. So it's like isolation after isolation after isolation. If you combine that with him practicing hate and violence for over a decade, and imagine every waking moment of your life being terrified of everyone in the world around you, because everyone who's not white is an enemy, everyone who is white and isn't with you is a traitor. Like, you see the harm and the suffering that isolation produces. I really believe that the next suffering, isolated person out there on the verge of hurting themselves or someone else can be reached by a widespread practice of kindness. Now, the misconception is that kindness is somehow like rolling over and letting them walk all over you. That's not the case whatsoever. In no case did my boss or my coworkers let me walk all over them, but they defied my hate and violence with kindness. A great parallel to this is you may have heard even hear about the neo-Nazi march in Charlottesville, Virginia this past August in the United States, in which over 1,000 primarily young white men, there was a handful of women, but it was mainly men, gathered and had a neo-Nazi march, and they were met with violence by Antifa groups, and someone ended up being killed by the neo-Nazis. There was a lot of photography that happened during this march. And so a lot of these young men who were marching all of a sudden they're on the front page going, "Rah!" and their faces everywhere. And some well-meaning people said, okay, I know who that is. That's John Smith. He goes to Virginia State. I'm going to get him kicked out of school. I'm going to get him fired from where he works. That's the way to create another Wade Page. That's the way to create another Dylan Roof, who murdered 9 people in Charleston, South Carolina. When there's no one more dangerous than someone with nothing to lose. And so when we isolate people and we make them suffer more and we take away jobs and we take away school, we are creating terrorists. I think a more appropriate response, if we said, hey, that's John Smith, is to go to John Smith and be like, hey, John, please come visit the mosque with me and speak to the imam. Please come break bread with the rabbi for Shabbat dinner, and let's talk. And if you still want to get tough, you could be like, or you'll get fired. But give someone an option. I think it's important to not allow racist, harmful behavior to happen. We absolutely need to stick up for the people who are affected by the behavior, and that needs to be the priority. But if we want that behavior to end, we also have to consider the people engaging in the behavior and have the courage to open up to them and say, look, we're here to help you. We want to be your friend. We want to help deal with the challenges that you're facing and find a way for all of us to move forward together. Thank you.
Building on this question, I'd also like to ask, for example, here currently in Finland and in Europe, there's a very timely debate on whether racist organizations should be banned, made illegal.
Right.
Of your inside and outside knowledge of this subject, what is your take on it?
My experience back in the days of the movement was we considered the government our number one enemy. And it was all the easier to do that when the government was coming at us. That then we could really point to, like, this is the actual offense that the government is committing, and therefore that's why we're declaring war on the government. When governments formally ban racist hate groups, it validates all of the paranoia behind their narrative. It tells them that everything they believe is true, and it galvanizes them to become more militant, more withdrawn, and more seated in their beliefs than they ever were before. Also, it tells their prospects, like people who are at risk of joining, it lets them know that I think it makes joining more attractive than it would be otherwise, because a lot of the driver that gets people involved in this is this feeling of rebelling. Like for me, I want to rebel. And if the government said, you can't do this, I'm going to be like, I'm doing it.
Yeah, it becomes the forbidden fruit, no?
Exactly. The other issue is I believe that free speech is a pressure valve. I think when there is free speech, yeah, it results in public hate speech, but it also results in, it doesn't create a pressure cooker where the hate becomes more dangerous than it would be if it was released. And working in Scandinavia quite a bit, Sweden has a much larger problem with far-right groups than Denmark does, like far greater. In Denmark, there's virtually zero threat from far-right groups at this time. Sweden, it's a huge issue. There's refugee hostels being attacked. There's people attacked in the streets. There's demonstrations. And Sweden is the country where those groups are banned. Sweden is the country that has laws against hate speech, Denmark doesn't. And to me, I think that's a very plain example of why banning hate speech and banning these groups is not effective.
And thank you for sharing your story. I wanted to ask, what has been the toughest audience you have been sharing your story with? I assume there are very few racists, if any, in the audience today. So how often you are able actually to talk to those people who think like you used to, and how is the message received?
Yeah, I hope I do someday. I hope I have the opportunity to speak to a room full of racists. I've not so far, and if I were physically in that situation, I would likely be attacked and beat to death. Like I can't have that kind of proximity to them, which is why media is very important, because it's my way of reaching people that I couldn't reach otherwise. I don't know that I've ever really worked with like a hostile audience. To be perfectly frank, and this really only happens in the States. Like here, I see it's pretty much mostly, if not all, white people in the audience. Here, it doesn't really bother me. But when I'm in the States and I'm speaking to an audience of all white people, I'm kind of like, ugh, like they're not going to like what I got to say. And every time I felt that way, I've been proven horribly wrong. Like afterwards, they would come up and people would tell me how much they appreciated it. So, and along those lines, the first talk I did publicly was at the Black Man's Forum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. 95% black audience, go figure, and they were absolutely amazing. The reception that I've gotten from audiences of color, from Jewish audiences, Muslim audiences, has been absolutely amazing. And honestly, I don't think I could continue doing this if it wasn't for that kind of support.
one last question, very quickly. A very, very brief question, and then we have to end there.
I'm very interested in knowing how it kind of all began, because according to my knowledge, Wisconsin isn't like super multicultural to begin with.
Right.
And not known for kind of ethnic clashes or anything along those lines. So how do you hate if there's like very few people of other ethnic origin or religion or sexual orientation?
That's a great question. Milwaukee, Wisconsin is the most segregated city in the United States for many years running. And that segregation, the separation actually makes it much easier to hate. The segregation in Milwaukee has created crushing poverty and struggle in Milwaukee's inner city. There's blocks and square miles after square miles that look like war zones because there's no money in there, there's no public investment. The people have gone through generation after generation of suffering and poverty. And if you don't understand how that came to be, and if you don't have conversations with those people to see that they are good human beings who just want to work hard and raise their families, it's very easy to just point at it from afar and go, oh, look what they did to their neighborhood. That's going to happen to my neighborhood if I let them move next door. So that separation actually fuels the hatred. And when hate groups are aware of that, as we were, they cash in on it left and right. I'll try to finish this quickly, but I had a friend in Toronto, Canada, back in the movement days. And when we went from town to town, the first thing we wanted to know is where the ghetto was. And we wanted to know that because, honestly, we were terrified of the ghetto. We would have never admitted that, but that was the main reason. We also wanted to drive by and point our fingers and go, oh, look how horrible that is. So as I was going to Toronto, I asked my buddy, I'm like, okay, he's giving me directions, and I'm like, where's the ghetto? And he's like, we don't really have a ghetto here. Things aren't that bad. And I'm like, well, where all the blacks live? And he's like, oh, it's horrible, man. They live like everywhere with everybody. And I'm just like, oh, that's terrible. And he's like, yeah, it's really hard to be a racist here. Like, seriously, that's I'll never forget that exchange. And that's followed suit. Everywhere I go where it is a diverse economy and everyone participates, everyone can live in a nice area together, it makes it very difficult for these groups to gain foothold. Whereas in areas where there is stark segregation, that's a very ripe environment for it.
And with this thought, we have to end. Thank you so much, Arno. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.